We're recording, so thanks everyone for being here. I'll let you take it away for the intro. Good.
Great. Okay. Yeah. Nice to see so many people here. This is wonderful. Good morning, everybody. So I just want to quickly introduce the star of the show today, Ray Stryker. He'll be defending his thesis for us. So Race came to UVI from the New College of Florida with his undergraduate degree was in environmental science and studies in political science. And he's also currently a fellow in the Diverse Knowledge Systems for Climate Adaptation Fellowship from the USGS, which is a big part of his, was a big part of his thesis work. So proud of him for that. And he's also currently an intern with DPNR, with the Division of Fish and Wildlife. So it's been really great to see him develop those things while he's been here at UVI and see how it all relates to his interests in the research. So without further ado, I want to let him take it away. He'll be presenting his thesis research titled "The Effectiveness of Local and Exotic Vegetation Buffers at Reducing Runoff Generation and Sediment Production in the U.S. Virgin Islands." So take it away, Race.
All right. Well, thank you for that introduction there, David. As he was talking about, I'm going to be talking about sediment production and the marine environment in the U.S. Virgin Islands, particularly focusing on buffer strips and something that I like to call reef-safe landscapes. Before I get into that, though, I would like to thank a couple of the institutions that were funding this project. First is VI EPSCoR and the National Science Foundation. Second would be the USGS and Morgan State through the Diverse Knowledge Systems Fellowship. Finally, UVI and the School of Agriculture. And a quick shout out to Plaza East for donating so many pallets to my project. That was very helpful of them. So getting into the background of this project here, I'm going to start with a conceptual overview, which is a cycle that I think drives a lot of what I'm going to be talking about, and is a cycle that we can make work positively or negatively. So land management decisions have downstream effects that impact our coastal ecosystems. And to a large extent, the health of those coastal ecosystems impacts livelihoods of people in the Virgin Islands, either through fishing or tourism revenue. And it also affects our climate resilience with the health of mangroves and coral reefs acting as a buffer for wave action during hurricanes and increasing the biodiversity of our surrounding waters. If our land management activities negatively impact those ecosystems, it has a negative impact on livelihoods and climate resilience. And then if we are doing positive things on land, we can have that cycle be a positive feedback loop. So more specifically with this project, I was focusing on terrestrial sediment, which is one of the most important sources of pollution in the marine environment locally. Territory-wide action is kind of required to reduce the impacts of sediment production because it's a non-point source pollution and can come from a wide variety of different areas. And that kind of necessitates a need for a solution that can be deployed across a wide variety of areas in the Virgin Islands, and hopefully one that isn't too costly. I thought it would be a great opportunity to look for solutions kind of outside of traditional scientific knowledge systems, and kind of consulted the community about, what the state of knowledge was on erosion, what land management practices were currently being used, and incorporated those into the study that I conducted. So one of the things driving this is ridge-street connectivity. When it rains and the soil can't soak up all the water, you get runoff, and runoff can cause soil erosion, which then transports sediments, sometimes to the marine environment, sometimes just lower down. Some key factors affecting that are the antecedent soil moisture, or how wet it is before it rains, the velocity of the water in the runoff, the erodibility of soil, and impacting those last two is plant cover. Here you can see a couple of examples of erosion and suspended sediment in water in different areas in the Virgin Islands. The one on the left obviously has much more suspended sediment than the one on the right. And then when it rains, a lot of that runoff is aggregated in guts or ephemeral streams in the Virgin Islands. And here you can see after a significant rain event, there was enough water to flow through the gut, scour out a beach, and wash a lot of that kind of yucky brown water into the marine environment, which is also transporting that sediment. So sediment has a lot of deleterious effects on corals. It can directly damage corals by smothering them or through abrasion. Suspended sediments can shade out coral reefs, causing metabolic stress because they do need light to photosynthesize. It can prevent recruitment. Have a seat for a sec. Sorry, Nabari just walked in. The global threat of terrestrial sediment kind of varies from location to location, but we have a lot of good data on the acute local threats. So this graph is one that I refer to quite a bit because it shows kind of a key factor with land management. Everything under that arc is caused by human activity. So unpaved roads have been found to be one of the most significant sources of sediment production on land, and I think are an area that need to be specifically targeted in terms of sediment reduction. So targeted to reduce kind of the connectivity from ridge to reef. And one of the things that I'm focusing on is using vegetation to disrupt that connectivity and act as a buffer. So with that being said, the main question I'm investigating is what plant cover types produce the least sediment during overland flow events. The main hypothesis is that cover types or vegetation with a higher density of stems can slow water more effectively, which causes less shear stress on sediment and less erosion, and is also able to slow down water from upslope and potentially cause sediment to be deposited in these buffer strips, which will reduce the amount that's transported into the marine environment. And that kind of functions where you have a bunch of stems in the path of water, and obviously the more there are, the slower that water is going to move because it has to navigate around all of those stems. So talking about local land management practices, it turns out that erosion and runoff are not commonly understood as major issues in US Virgin Islands. The most common land management practice that I found was people kind of just let areas grow in or go to bush, where a bunch of weedy vegetation will recruit in that area and kind of stay there. I did get a secondhand account of people planting snake plant, which can be seen in that picture there. And I decided to use that as a cover type as well, because people said they planted it directly, but also because it can be found quite frequently on the side of unpaved roads. So moving into my methodology here a little bit. Runoff flumes have been used to test really similar experiments based on stem density. So I decided to go with runoff flumes for this experiment. Here you can see the flumes that I designed with the 4 cover types that I'll talk a little bit more about later. The basic flume design kind of looks like this. At the top of the flume, there is a tank that fills with water and overflows to generate sheet flow as it goes onto the run-on ramp. Then when that water enters the surface of the buffer strip, that's where most of the stuff that I'm testing takes place. And then I collected the resulting runoff and any sediment that was transported in it. A little bit more about that flow tank. Water was added to it through a hose that had a bunch of holes in it so it would spill over evenly. And we installed flow meters at the top of it so we can control directly the amount of water entering the flume. We decided to set that amount of water to be representative of tropical rainfall conditions and Tropical Storm Fiona. landing on 100 square meters of unpaved road. So the independent variable in this experiment was obviously cover type. I used vetiver grass, which is widely regarded as a good erosion control grass. It's used frequently in tropical and subtropical areas, very popular in Hawaii, and there have been efforts to establish it in Puerto Rico. Then I have snake plant, which was a community suggestion. Those are propagules that I planted. They're not fully mature, so if you don't see the long sword-shaped leaves, that's why. Then there's the fallow cover type and the control of bare soil to see if planting anything is actually better than just doing nothing. I used a random complete block design to lay out this experiment. And this kind of design is commonly used in agricultural or greenhouse settings to normalize small variations that you might have in things like microclimate, wind, or slope in this case. One of the main things that I had to keep the same across all flumes was the soil bulk density, because if water is able to infiltrate the soil faster in one, you'll have different runoff at the end. I did that using a process called slurry packing, where I added 5 centimeter layers, saturated those layers with water, and then compacted them by hand. So that's a picture of me doing that. It was a pretty muddy process, but it paid off in the end. I'll talk more about why later. Some of the other variables that I was measuring, I looked at the time to initial runoff to see if I could determine the speed of runoff, the rate of runoff accumulation. Time to rill formation was a very important variable because that determined when I would stop the experiment. Rills are essentially small gullies. And when you have that kind of formation, there's a lot of literature to suggest that that means significant amounts of sediment are being produced in that area. So if I saw rills above 15 centimeters, I consider that to be a point of failure for the cover type. I collected the total amount of runoff produced, but that wasn't a very useful metric. I'll talk a little bit more about why later. The sediment concentration and then sediment production rate. I already mentioned soil bulk density as a covariate, but I also measured the soil volumetric water content, which is a way of assessing antecedent soil moisture. And we measured that at 10 random locations right before the experiment was run to normalize for that variable. The statistics I ran were a Pearson's correlation on all of the variables tested, a one-way ANOVA on each of the covariates to see if there was any significant difference across cover types, and then an analysis of covariance for the dependent variables with the covariates that I mentioned. So now moving into some of the results and discussion. The image you see here is pretty indicative of my results. The jars on the left are from the fallow cover type, and you can see there's a very visible difference in the amount of sediment produced by these flumes. Going back to the covariates for a second, the analysis of covariance showed that there wasn't a significant difference across either covariate, which was good because it means I was able to adequately control for those in the experiment. Then the main result is that the fallow cover type produced significantly less sediment and had a much lower runoff rate than the other cover types that were tested. It's important to note that the fallow cover type wasn't significantly different than vetiver in terms of the amount of sediment that it produced per liter of water, but there are some other considerations that I'll talk a little bit more about that later. One thing that was interesting in the results of this experiment, the original hypothesis was that stem density would be the primary driving factor of performance. And we looked at stem density as well as percent stem area, which I thought would be a better metric for how much of an impediment any of the vegetation is to runoff. And it turns out that the fallow cover type had very low stem densities, but performed the best. And one of the reasons for that was the fallow cover type had a lot of horizontal stems which acted kind of like a dam and were able to slow overland flow in ways that the primarily vertical stems of vetiver grass or snake plant weren't able to. And after the fact, I found some literature talking about sediment obstruction potential, which is a three-dimensional way of conceptualizing a plant's above and below ground structure as an impediment to overland flow and its sediment retention capacity. So that I think would have been a much better metric. And if I were to investigate this further, I would move forward with SOP as opposed to stem density. So the main conclusions that I have from this experiment are that the fallow vegetation was the most effective because it performed the best across all of the response variables. And in terms of its performance related to vetiver grass, it's much easier to establish. The vegetation was allowed to establish for 3 months, and we had much faster growth from the fallow cover type than the vetiver grass. Also, vetiver grass isn't appropriate in all ecotones. So whatever fallow vegetation recruits in ecotones across the Virgin Islands, I think it's more applicable, and it's a lot cheaper. You don't need to buy fallow vegetation. It will recruit naturally with some rather passive land management. So as a solution for buffer zones, I think it's one of the most effective. And with that, I will take any questions. Yeah, Edmund, go ahead.
Can you hear me? I'm using a headless, like a wireless set that I'm not really sure if it's working well or not.
I can hear you just fine, yeah.
Awesome. So one of the things that is very important in keeping sediment in place is actually the root system architecture of the plant. Can you comment on how the root architecture of these different treatments varied?
Yes, a little bit. When it comes to, well, I guess there's one distinction to be made here. First of all, this experiment was focusing on how the cover types reacted when water washed over them from uphill, and their ability to retain sediment that was produced above them. Also, an important factor is their ability to hold in the soil that's beneath them. So when you're talking about root structure, vetiver is widely regarded for having a very extensive root system, and that's why it's primarily used for erosion control. Similar grasses, like the ones that recruited in the fallow cover type, one of them was guinea grass. The other was something called running grass. I have the scientific names for those later that I can bring up. And the third plant we found really frequently was tantan, which has large tap roots. So that structure is similar, but potentially not as deep rooting as vetiver grass. And then snake plant has almost tuber-like root systems that are pretty shallow. So if we're looking at the stability of a hillside for landslides and things like that, vetiver might be a good candidate. But when you're looking at kind of shallow roots and things like that, I think, again, that sediment obstruction potential, which is above and below ground, would have been a better metric. But I think, at least with what we saw in this experiment, we could say that given the level of establishment between fallow and vetiver, they might have had comparable root systems.